You're listening to The Big Change, the only podcast sharing insights and experiences into the world of credit. Credit includes every stage from customer to cash. Credit has always been the most interesting and varied area of business, the only one that connects with all the other stakeholders and the only one where the word passion is regularly heard. I'm really excited about this interview with Siobhan Rriggott and Tom Bangemann from the Rriggott Group. It's a demonstration of communicating from home. We recorded this with Siobhan in the UK, Tom in Germany and myself in the Czech Republic. Here's a little taster of what's to come.
And always going to be like that. And I read a recent survey that over 70% of companies have said hacking has increased since COVID-19. So I think there's also a lot of criminal energy out there that is trying to use this situation. And then I think also on your topic of trainings, people will then look at certain trainings that maybe now they don't really have time for, or don't have sort of the peace of mind to focus on. So
a new norm will ensue in some point.
I've never used the word unprecedented quite so much.
Siobhan has over 15 years of business consulting experience as a business advisor, researcher and client support. During her time with the Rriggott Group, she has worked with order-to-cash teams and business service organisations of different maturities across various industries and geographies. Her core areas of expertise are customer-to-cash process design and realigning operations to more efficiently support companies' objectives. Specialities include all customer-to-cash, global business services, shared services development, outsourcing, benchmarking and business transformation. Tom is Senior Vice President of Business Transformation, where he's worked for more than 17 years in regional and practice leadership roles. His experience includes a set of over 100 consulting projects. He was also named HR Superstar by HR Magazine 4 times. Tom has been voted onto various expert panels around the world. He was chairman of events in Europe, Australia, Dubai and China. And he was also named Thought Leader of the Year by SSON in 2010. Both Siobhan and Tom have been friends and supporters of the association since our early days. Right, let's get going. Good morning and thanks for taking time out to join us today. It must be a busier time than usual at the Rriggott Group. We're now a month or so into the lockdown. What are your clients focusing on the most?
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say it's certainly very interesting times. Lots of discussions with clients, with members. Obviously, you can imagine, the focus has been really the immediate situation. Talking to lots of clients, really sort of sanity checking what they're up to. Very much the conversation are focused on the current situation. Normally we're talking to clients about, what are they doing looking to go forward, but very much it is more that transition to working from home and the immediate actions in terms of, from an order to cash perspective, in terms of collections activity, but also, around maintaining supply. I say that, most of them are focused on the current time. There are some that are also focusing on ongoing initiatives and projects, but, really where they support the current situation. So particularly those which are around maybe more technology and digital transformation activities. But certainly, absolutely, the priority is cash flow for the most of the organisations we're talking to at the moment.
Yeah, I just echo Siobhan's comments. Cash is definitely number one. Technology topics are interesting for everybody because of the home office moves in terms of communication technology and all these tools that you need for that. And in general, of course, everybody's expecting automation to increase based on the situation. Some topics like GBS related topics, I would say, are stable. And then there's certain projects that might have been delayed because there's certain other priorities right now, as mentioned.
Okay. Did you experience many companies that have struggled with the transition to working from home?
It's a funny one, I suppose. Obviously we didn't speak to them in the midst of that transition. So most, when you've spoken to them, that transition has gone fairly well. I think for some of them it was a number of days in terms of being able to make that happen. I think, generally that lockdown and the transition to work from home, happened for most over a couple of days. There wasn't a lot of advance notice. So, lots of conversations around securing additional laptops or renting laptops, but obviously then that became wasn't an option any longer. Lots of clients have physically moved desktops home. I think that's particularly maybe where organisations are working with the BPO providers and where the staff were more desktop based. So we've had lots of stories around, desktops being put into taxis. Like Tom's already mentioned, some challenges around from a communication perspective, security settings, enabling people to access, the networks remotely. So I'd say, I think most have made that happen. There was no choice in terms of making it happen. And if we said they struggled for a couple of days, but in the main, most organisations you're speaking to, within a week, of the lockdown happening, we're able to make sure that their workforce is, up and running, has the appropriate access bandwidth. There is also stories about, having to provide people with dongles and things like that, because in certain areas and certain geographies, maybe individuals didn't have, the setup at home that you might have in some other markets. And I think maybe, that's particularly maybe if you look at Europe versus maybe India, there was more issues around Wi-Fi connectivity in that area. But, in the main, all organisations I'm talking to now and all individuals have made it work, however they've had to do that. Obviously, Tom, was there anything you would add on that one? I don't know if any more specific insights or feedback you've got.
No, it's exactly like you mentioned also in my experience. In some geographies, and you mentioned India and places like Philippines, the infrastructure doesn't always support this move to home office, and people didn't have the laptops or their bandwidth was not there, so companies needed to help with that. And as you mentioned, cybersecurity, companies are still liable for the work that is being done by their employees, even if they sit at home, and the original data security and cybersecurity plans never included people sitting at home. So in many cases, I think companies are just hoping that these rules that are in place will hold, but I'm not sure it's always going to be like that. And I read a recent survey that over 70% of companies have said hacking has increased since COVID-19. So I think there's also a lot of criminal energy out there that is trying to use this situation, and to some extent might be a race against the time for companies to fill those security holes that might be there, because they have to go very quickly. Sometimes just over a weekend or in a matter of a few days, from hundreds of people in the office to being utilizing home office for most of the people. So it's exactly those issues. But as you said, it's the result is much better than actually expected, if you're really honest. You could have expected a lot of catastrophes, and still, I would say what we hear from our clients, 70-80% are doing well, and there are some who aren't, but most have made the transfer work quite well for them.
Yeah, and I think maybe one thing that made me think about as you were talking, Tom, was around business continuity plans. Like, most organisations that most of the contacts myself and Tom would be talking to are within a GBS organisation, and they would have fairly strong, robust plans from a business continuity planning perspective. But I think certainly some of those plans will be reviewed, because I think in the main, most organisations' business continuity plans, were to move to a different location, or to get up and run in a second location. And in this case, this scenario maybe wasn't covered, in the sense of there is no alternative or backup location that anybody can use. It is a global lockdown, and therefore I think very few organisations had a business continuity plan where you would have 100% of the workforce working remotely and from home. So I think when you consider that, like you said, in the main, I think it's amazing actually that most organisations have been able to do that transition, and to do it as quickly as they have been able to. And I think it's probably worth acknowledging those that may be more digitally advanced have probably maybe fared a little better in that transition.
I think those points probably move on to a question I was going to ask later, but it's probably apposite now. Have you seen any cases where work has been moved from one geography to another, from Asia to Europe or vice versa?
Yeah, there's some, but it's fairly small in volume. I would say it's not more than 10 or 20% of companies that have moved some volumes, and they're also small volumes or in certain areas. There's a few reasons for that, but the main reason, of course, is that hypothetically you have this GBS set up with different centers and they work on high standards and highly automated, but of course we know that most people are not there, and therefore just moving a bit of work is not so easy to do. BPOs would also argue the same in their favor in terms of saying, look, if one company has less volume, the other one has more volume, we can compensate, so it's a great benefit. And that's true if you're in a similar environment, so same kind of process, same kind of technology. And so even within captives, they couldn't always easily move work. And also if you have a company whose business, for example, has increased during this time, and we have them, for example, in healthcare or in telecoms, many of those clients have more work than they had before. Then it increases on all fronts. So the center in Europe wouldn't have more capacity available than they had before either to actually take over that work. But there have been some of those movements, and to answer your question, the movement typically was from Asia to Central Eastern Europe. So the clients in Poland, Czechia, Hungary, they have received additional volumes. I haven't heard of anybody in India or Philippines receiving additional volumes. On the contrary, some of the transitions have actually been delayed. So I think it's more that direction, but not the huge volume.
Okay. So we said at the beginning that there's a lot of emphasis on cash collection, and the association recommends that best practice is that there shouldn't really be more than 2.5% overdue, or ideally as close to zero as possible. But many companies have been quite relaxed in this over the last decade or so. So where you've noticed an increase and focus on cash collection, how's that actually manifesting itself?
Okay, I was going to say, where you mentioned about where we've noticed an increase. I think everybody I've spoken to is an increased focus on cash collection. I think Tom sort of touched on there's a couple of industries maybe where we've got increased demand, like we said, the telecoms and maybe some of the pharma and healthcare companies. I think for those, maybe the immediate focus is on the supply chain and getting the product out, and therefore then they will move to the cash. But I think generally in the main, all organisations I'm talking to have got that increased focus on cash and collections activities and optimising their cash flow. To some extent, I feel like a lot of the conversations I'm having, a lot of the actions organisations are taking, a lot of the guidance I'm giving is the same that I would give at any time. In the main, really, what we're saying is really order to cash good practices are ever more important now. Yes, the urgency may be greater and the focus may be, the frequency may be a little bit different, but the best practices still apply. You've got to have, first of all and foremost, you've got to have a good visibility of your ledger. You've got to understand, what's in there, what's current, what's overdue, what's disputed, what have you invoiced and what's falling due. And that's there for both from a collections perspective, but also for the business to be able to make decisions as well. So I think first and foremost is the visibility. I think second to that is understanding, is understanding where the risks are. And all clients I've spoke to are either looking to refresh their credit limits or looking to work more closely with the credit bureaus to get more up-to-date information. But generally, making that assessment of where have you got risks in the portfolio because you've got customers in a particular industry or segment which have been more impacted by the disruption. So I think that would be my second thing, is really, scanning the portfolio, understanding where the risks are. The other thing is and this is slightly different, is talking to your customers as you always would, but really just from an operational perspective to understand where they are, how they're set up, how they're responding to this. If you're sending invoices and they were manual, then, you know, if they're working remotely and working from home, then obviously a print and send isn't really an option at this stage. So I think it is that, you know, generally working closely with your customers, understanding their own operational setup, but also understand maybe where they're experiencing cash flow issues. And then obviously, you know, the main action is around obviously your receivables, your ledger, coverage of the ledger, ensuring coverage of the ledger, making sure you're, you know, focusing on the values, making sure you're focusing on the risks, make sure you've got robust mechanisms in place to, you know, record customer contact, to record any contact with the customer around extending payment terms, any requests for payment plans. So I feel a lot of, like, sort of coming back to, really, I feel like a lot of what I'm saying is general good order to cash practice. But at the same time, understanding, you know, that's going to give you the ability to collect more efficiently where you're able to do so and where the customer can pay. But we are going to move into more of a zone where the customer can't pay, and therefore where some of these activities are. It's more about really understanding, therefore, where the risks are, where you might want to address provisions for bad debt, and, you know, where you expect to get some losses. But yeah, I think in the main, order to cash best practices stand today, and I think more organisations are applying those and focusing on those. In the main, I think most of those organisations, you know, most I speak to, it's more of a sanity check. You know, it's going through, are you doing this? Are you doing that? And in the main, most organisations are doing those things, and also included in maybe more the commercial and sales teams where they need to as well. Sort of it, good visibility, understand where your risks are, communicate with your customers, and ensure good coverage of the ledger and maintaining that contact history.
Yeah, I mean, all that stuff is basic credit control, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so moving on to my next point, and mainly this one for Tom. You and I have shared a lot of presentations, and your presentations always include a high emphasis on what constitutes world-class investment in talent. My personal experience as a coach and so on, and I guess yours as well. I think it's fair to say that most SSCs fall pretty short in this area. Do you think that this will actually generate a reality check and an improvement and more focus on credit training, if you like, or more awareness?
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully. I mean, obviously, if you've seen Hackett research or Hackett presentations from myself or somebody else, they've been talking about some of these things for years now. Things like agility, higher automation levels, talent management, investing into talent, and so on. And now we see that all of these things would have been really useful to be in place before this crisis hit. So without wanting to point fingers, but it's also good to know that all this research and all these trend statements actually make sense. In terms of the talent area, I mean, there's plenty of talent out there. The thing that we often sort of criticize a little bit is that while companies always state that people are their biggest asset, if you then look at the training expenses, which are typically around 1% of budget, that doesn't seem to fit. So if I invest 1% into training and people are my biggest asset, then somehow there's a big portion of marketing in this, and that might change. And we see, at least in the work that's been done in GBS organizations, that the majority of them has higher demand for online trainings currently. That might have to do with the fact that there's people to some extent available to do that, of course. The question is whether that remains, but I would assume that remains, because there is a need for that training. Mm-hmm. And now that people get used to this, it's unlikely they will want to go back to a situation where they let it go again. I mean, we know from previous crises that some things you say in a crisis might be forgotten again 1 or 2 years later, right? Mm-hmm. But we're probably going to get used to this situation because it takes a bit longer than last time. And then I don't think tools that have been implemented and ways of working that have been implemented are really going to disappear. So there might be some small adjustments here and there, but I think trainings, especially online trainings and anything that has to do with that, both in volume and in terms of utilizing those tools, will increase now and will stay on a higher level. And it's good because then we correct some of those metrics I mentioned that are somehow not logical.
Well, I hope that's the case. Obviously, that's where we have a huge investment in that area. And from my perspective, it's been quite a slow take up at the moment. We've even been offering modules for free, and we haven't had a great deal of response from that. Maybe the solution is it has to be more interactive training. When we say online, it's more interactive rather than just giving people things to read in their own time or study in their own time.
Yeah, and it might also just be the cycle of things. It's a bit like Siobhan mentioned in the beginning, that most people currently are still in this phase where they deal with the current situation. So most of the activity is still targeted at just dealing with the issues.
Yeah.
Then we'll move into probably some sort of interim phase, which is this on and off phase where we have some restrictions and others are maybe lifted. But that phase might, I don't know better than you, but that phase might take a year or even longer. And in that phase, people will probably get used to using all these tools. Because currently, I think the mindset is still that we think this is a crisis that takes a few months and then it's gone. So we're sort of living out of a suitcase.
Yeah.
But when we get used to this being actually some sort of new normal, or the reality at least for a longer period of time, then we start actually behaving accordingly. And then I think also on the topic of trainings, people will then look at certain trainings that maybe now they don't really have time for, or don't have sort of the peace of mind to focus on. So I think those things will come. And also some of the more strategic work that maybe has been stopped here and there will also need to come back, because it's a bit like with the IT investments at Y2K or at other relevant points in development. When they were stopped, there was a lot of investment afterwards. Many of these activities needed to be sort of caught up with, and investment increased again. So not everything's going to be delayed and come back, but something certainly will have new peaks, I think, after this crisis comes down a little bit.
That's a very good point. Like you said, the emphasis now is just on doing rather than sort of anything strategic. It's just minimizing the damage maybe in certain cases.
Yeah. I think I'd absolutely agree with everything Tom said on that. I think everybody is in. I feel like almost this week that some of the conversations have started to change a little bit about appreciating maybe some of the backlogs as they come out. But I think absolutely until maybe this week, it's just on, making it work operationally that people are up and running. And I think that will change because, I don't think we're looking at, like Tom says, a new normal, or if we go back to normal, then it's not 2 months, it's not 3 months. We're looking at 12 or 18 months. So I think absolutely, one of the emphasis generally is about keeping people in touch, getting people communicating. And I think therefore, I think training and bringing people together in a virtual and interactive way is maybe something that will come back on the radar, but maybe it's just got to wait a few weeks.
Yeah. I think I think you're right. That's a very good point. And because the whole thing is, this is genuine disruption right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's a new norm will ensue at some point.
I've never used the word unprecedented quite so much.
Well, yes.
And it genuinely is.
Yeah, I mean, I keep telling people I've been working for 40 years and I've seen quite a few different things, crazy interest rates and riots and inflations and all sorts of things that have impacted the world, but certainly not anything like this. And I just hope it never happens again.
No.
Okay, so we're getting near the end of our time, and as always, it's a pleasure talking to you guys. Before we finish off, though, could you perhaps finish off by saying what general advice would you offer to your clients based on these recent experiences?
I think it's a little bit probably recapping on some of the things we've already said, to apply those good practices in order to cash right now. But I think, and also, like I said, is that the immediate challenge of transition and work from home, but also appreciating that there's normal as we knew it isn't going to come around for quite a while. So really to start to think about what that new normal looks like, which may be 12 months. So from a collection specific perspective, it will be starting to, like I said, do all the things that we said, but then start to think about really, where are maybe you potentially, if you've got bad debt losses that are coming your way, to look to update your provisions and accordingly. But just generally start to look a little bit forward as well. Yes, there's the immediate activities, but then, if this is going to be the new normal, then there's also normal day-to-day operational activities that also need to start to get picked up as well, whether that be backlogs, whether that's manual invoices that haven't gone out, manual done letters that haven't gone out. You need to find new ways of doing those things. And also, I think just generally start to look at maybe the things that you can do to support what's going to be a new norm. So going back to the conversations we had around automation and digital activities, start to pick some of those activities that were already on the radar up and start to bring them forward so that they can support the new normal. I think that's everything. I don't know, Tom, would you have anything to add? And I think, sorry, just before I maybe hand it to Tom, and just generally, obviously, is that monitoring the well-being of your team as well. I think that's something to add. We talked about the order to cash, talked about the cash, talked about automation, but I think the general advice is also working closely with your teams and considering the people who are your greatest asset in terms of what support that they may need over these times as well, to support working in a very different way over what potentially is not a short period of time. Okay, so I'll hand over to Tom, see if Tom's got anything to add on that general advice question.
Yeah, those are good points. I mean, I think it's probably difficult to give one type of advice to everybody, because there are clearly companies who are suffering a lot and there are others who are winners of this crisis. So they probably need to get slightly different advice. But obviously, for those who are suffering, cash is king. And if they haven't done their 3 scenario cash forecast, they should have done already. They just need to make sure they survive. That's priority number one. And those companies will have to do whatever they have to do. That's clear. But for the other ones, I think in crisis times, you can always see who you're dealing with in difficult times. And therefore, I also think that, people will remember what you did in difficult times. So for companies, as Siobhan pointed out, it's really important to be, show some sort of empathy to employees and manage things in a sustainable and good way, and not do everything that they could do immediately, just to, flick some numbers on the Excel sheet. And then, as was pointed out, client and employee relationships are really key. So we need to communicate more, because we can't manage by walking around anymore, right? So we need to do something else. And I think a lot of people don't know actually what to do to manage their teams and departments. So there's going to be a lot of work there also, where HR departments need to help the other ones to get these things going, and technology needs to come in to help out. But people need training on a lot of these things. So those are maybe some of the advices that I would give. But in general, I think it's really critical to remember that a crisis like this probably hits us, once or twice in our lifetime. As you mentioned, Mark, there's not been any pandemic in our lifetimes, because the last one was 100 years ago. And luckily, we don't experience any wars, but maybe we'll get an ecological crisis next time, which probably is not easier either. But these situations really are those where you need to behave properly, because that's what sort of defines how your business and how your relationships will work after this.
I think the black swans that you've been referring to, I think, will be a higher profile in future.
Yeah, probably.
It's been, I could happily continue this conversation all day, but, and it's always a pleasure talking to you, but we've been beaten by the clock. So, again, Siobhan, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. I'm looking forward to sharing this interview with the world in general, and I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback to it. So, take care, stay safe, and thank you very much.